Here we are. Good. So thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you to the people from the Society of Catholic Scientists to have me here. In this presentation, I would like to review the contribution of Catholic scientists, and I will take this down to the first 30 years following Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. Darwin's book took many years of compilations, and it was even accelerated by the fact that Alfred Wallace did write a paper on the same subject in 1858. The papers by Charles Darwin and Wallace were in fact published on the 1st of July, so that means today, 165 years ago, and it did not steer much attention. Charles Darwin finalized then his book Origin of Species that he published in 1859, and it was really a groundbreaking book because Darwin not only proposed common ancestry, that was in the air since Humboldt and Lamarck and the vestiges of the natural history of creation, but he proposed also a process for the underlying mechanism of the diversity of species. The text you have here is from the last paragraph of The Origin of Species, and we read the following. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. That's probably one of the most beautiful quotes of The Origin of Species. I want to draw your attention to two things here. First, he says, breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. So he he refers to the Creator from the second edition onwards. There were 6 editions in his lifetime. The work was expanding substantially, and he made this introduction and he left it there, although that got him a lot of criticism in his own circle. The second is that Charles Darwin really wanted to find biological laws that would be similar to the physical laws, with the same precision as physical laws have. And he said that he had found this in the process of natural selection in the evolutionary pathway of organisms. So Darwin's theory has basically 2 principles. First, common ancestry, and the second is the process of natural selection. Natural selection can be described with 5 words: variation, inheritance, selection, time, and adaptation. So it's an inherited variability in the organisms and the selection pressure to adapt to the environment. He also uses the term survival of the fittest. That was not actually coined by him, but by Spencer. And he used it in the way that it was the best fit to the environment. This was understood differently by Spencer and more by Haeckel, and therefore in German we have the translation that it is the survival of the strongest, which is wrong. Let's come to inherited variability. In Darwin's time, the source of inherited variability was unknown, and heredity was regarded as a blending process, and the offspring were essentially a dilution of the different parental characteristics. There was one person who knew otherwise. Oh no, okay, I think we leave that. This was Gregor Mendel. We already had him mentioned today. Gregor Mendel was an Augustinian friar, and he began his experiments in pea plants, Pisum sativum, which had been shown to be purely bred varieties. So he looked, for example, at purple and white pea plants that always produced the same color. It's also important to know that Pisum sativum is usually self-fertilizing, so it was a very good model for his experimentation. And because they are self-fertilizing, you can also break this easily by cross-fertilizing them, and this helped him to make his experiments. He wanted to find new variants by crossing the purple and the white pea plants. When he actually did that, he found out that all the plants were purple. In order to derive his laws, he did a lot of experiments with about 28,000 plants, which means in tedious planning, the use of detailed notes and a time frame of over 8 years, and the use of statistics in the setting of biology. He heard some lectures in mathematics from Christian Doppler in Vienna, and this might have helped him. He proved the existence of paired elementary units of heredity. He called them factors. We call them today genes. So he published his paper in 1866. It's called Versuche über Pflanzenhybride, which is translated Experiments on Plant Hybrids. And it's not actually such a good idea to present in such a strange language as German. Traits were distributed in specific ways in the first offspring generation. We see this here. So each of the offspring, so from the F1 generation, inherit one gene allele from the purple and one gene allele from the white plant. And since purple takes over or is dominant, as we call it in biology, over white, all the plants are purple. In the second offspring generation, via self-fertilization in this case, show the characteristic 3-to-1 breakup or split, and so they resembled the parent generation, but rather in a different split up. So the important thing here was that inheritance is not blending. Inheritance is particulate. He established what we call today the genotype and the phenotype. The terms were not from him, but came later in 1908 by a Swedish botanist called Johansson. In addition, he analyzed 7 different traits and showed that each trait was independently sorted into the gametes and the next generation. So the genes are the smallest particulates in inheritance. Another unit of inheritance are the chromosomes. And here, I did not say this, but I will talk here only about Catholic scientists, which means that I take out a lot of people that had a good say to this, but who were not Catholic or were not scientists. So I come to Theodor and Marcella Boveri. Theodor Boveri was a German-Italian cytologist, and he married the US-American Marcella O'Grady, and they worked together. It has been recently established that they really worked together, so she was not a co-author, which was unfortunately pretty frequent in that time. She was acknowledged in the acknowledgement section, but from letters, it can be clearly shown that she was part of those experiments. And you have here a picture of them with their daughter. What we see here is that in the cell division of the embryo, you see these particulate, okay, let me see, okay, here, you see those chromosomes, and Boveri could establish them as the as particulate matters of inheritance, and with the rediscovery of Gregor Mendel's laws in 1900, he also made the connection between genes and the chromosomes. If we look at Mendel's law of independent assortment, which I show you on the next picture, what we see here is that if you look at different traits and make the appropriate crossings, then you get a 9-to-3 to 3-to-1 split. In this case, the yellow seed is dominant over the green one, and the round one is dominant over the square one or the wrinkled one. So it would be intriguing to think that it would be intriguing to think that they were located in different chromosomes, the traits that he actually worked on. In fact, we know now that that was not the case. They were located on the chromosomes 1, 4, and 5 of 7 chromosomes times 2. And how can this be explained? The explanation for that came from another Catholic scientist. It was Father Franz Alfons Janssen, who did the following. He looked carefully at the meiosis, which are the two which are the cell divisions that lead to the gametes. And in the first of those steps, he could see that the chromosomes that you see here, one comes from the mother, one comes from the father, they actually align closely to each other. And what can happen then is that at specific points, there is a break, a rearrangement, and a fusion, so that at the end we see here, let's say, a paternal chromosome that has here this part from the maternal side coming. So if genes are located on very different places in the chromosomes, they can behave as they would be individually transmitted or independently transmitted. That's so he called this the chiasma type E, and we call it today crossing over. Crossing over was, Thomas Morgan Hunt, who made those well-known experiments on fruit flies. He got this concept of crossing over from Janssen and developed it further and brought it to the broader audience. Okay, oh, I need to be a little bit quicker. Good. So, the question is, can critique itself be a contribution to science? I would say in some cases, yes. We have here Georges Mivart, who in 1871 published his book Origin of Species, and he was one of the first who critiqued Charles Darwin's natural selection. He made 8 objectives. We are going through the first 3. Incipient structure, so if, let's say, 10% of a wing does not make a wing. So that was his first argument. Then he said there are closely similar structures of diverse origin. Today, we would talk about autologous structures and convergence in evolution. He also said that specific differences may develop suddenly instead of gradually, and we can think that this was later taken up by Stephen Gould when he talked about the punctuated equilibrium. Okay? Yeah. The next person I would like to introduce you is the Jesuit and biologist Erich Wassmann. He was mainly working with eusocial insects, so ants and termites. And he studied the interaction between ants, but also between ants and their guests in their colonies. So you have here, oh, not here. No, it went quite a bit. Okay, so you have here, hopefully. I'm not sure I can manage that. Okay, so on the left upper picture, you see on the right side the ant and on the left side the beetle that is closely resembling the ant species. So he then called this process a subform of natural selection that he called amical selection or friendly selection. Secondly, he said that natural selection is a negative force only, and he referred to the importance of embryonic development, as we just heard, that's a factor that is now introduced into the theory of evolution. His concepts were pretty outdated, but still interesting to notice. What is, we already heard that a scientific theory is not a one-stage thing. It's not, you have this and it doesn't change. No, it will be improved over time. And this is actually what happened in 1943 with the concept of modern synthesis, and then the proposed extended evolution synthesis in 2014. What we have now heard about two Catholic scientists who actually agreed with Darwin and Darwin's theory, although they may have some critique points. But was this the only point of view that could be taken by biologists and Catholic biologists? No. We have here the case of Jean-Henri Fabre. He was a very important entomologist and he was a keen observer. Darwin called him an inimitable observer. And Jean-Henri Fabre was not accepting evolution as a possible scientific explanation. And what he did is he explored instinctive behavior. He talked about the wisdom in insects because of that behavior, but also of the ignorance in insects, because as soon as he started to change the way that insects were behaving naturally, we could see that their instinctive behavior did not work very well later on. There was an exchange between Fabre and Darwin between 1880 and 1881. Darwin even proposed to Fabre to conduct specific experiments to test the excellent orientation sense of mason bees, and Fabre did those experiments. Unfortunately, he could not report them back to Charles Darwin, who died in 1882, but he did publish this. He published more than 30 books, and he was a person of deep faith, whose writings have been called a magnificent hymn to the glory of God. His books were widely read and also translated, but his critique of the evolutionary theory was always implicit and hidden between the lines, so his influence on the Catholic audience was basically none. I would now come to my second talk, which is educational contributions to the Catholic public. We have already heard that Rome said nothing to Charles Darwin's theory and all the discussions that came afterwards. There were basically three questions. Is evolution necessarily materialistic or atheistic? Is the evolutionary pathway compatible with God's creative action and providence? And third, what about common ancestry and the human soul? So Rome said nothing, but some journalists and theologians were taking sides, pro and con evolution, and the waves of argument and emotion were high. So Catholic clergy and lay people were looking for other information, and they found them mainly in the lectures and books of three scientists that engaged in the defense of compatibility between faith and science. The three players are, we already learned about Georges Mivart and Erich Warsmann, and the third one is John Sam, who was at Notre Dame University in the US. He was more an educator than a scientist, and he took on a lot of the arguments that Mivart made and put them into the context of his Catholic faith. He gave a lot of lectures that were noted by, and then in 1896, he wrote a book called Evolution and Dogma. This book made it to the index of forbidden Catholic books that was available at the time. And this prohibition, though, was never published because Rome asked John Sam to retract his books, especially his translation into the Italian language, and he did that. But it led to the fact that he was then later silenced on this fact and took his time to make explorations into South America. Okay, next. Is evolution materialistic and atheistic? So basically all the players that I mentioned to you had similar answers, so I'm just putting here single quotes on that. For this, I would like to refer to Erich Wassmann, who gave lectures in 1907 because he has been, let's say, really attacked by Ernst Haeckel, who had his own version of evolution, and he was a very outspoken atheist that later turned into a pantheist. So we see here that these positions can be switched rather easily. So Ernst Haeckel gave lectures in 1905 in which he attacked the book that Wassmann has read, and this was basically not noticed outside the Catholic world before. And Wassmann then replied to that in 1907 in 3 separate lectures. And what is important is that he gave these lectures in an audience that was not at all positive or in favor of his opinion. These were his scientist colleagues who were rather agnostic, atheistic, or followers of the Protestant tradition of Schleiermacher. So, theistische Evolutionslehre should be translated correctly as theistic evolution. It was translated into English into theistic doctrine of evolution, but that's actually not the right translation because Lehre simply means teaching and has nothing to do with doctrine. You probably have heard the term theistic evolution as mentioned by nowadays by many people in the mainly evangelical and Protestant faith tradition. Okay, I leave it here. I just say that he used his lectures to really defend his view of evolution compatible with faith. With regard to the second question, God's creative action and providence, Pater Mariusz did already discuss that in detail, so I thought I would rather only give you here a few hints. The key point was God's continuing creative action, which was at that time often called derived creation via secondary causes, and God's action is present in his providence. So if we can say that God is the Lord of history, we can also say that God is the Lord of natural history. I'm 5 minutes? 5 minutes. That's good. I made up some time. So with regard to the question of common ancestry and the human soul, all three were univocal in saying that the existence of a human soul infused in every human being is a question that should not be debated. Maybe here we should look at Wasserman, who said, investigating the descent and origin of man, the chief question is whence come his higher part, not whence come his lower part. So Mivar said similarly that man is not merely an intellectual animal, but he is also a free moral agent, and as such differs from all the rest of the visible universe. Another point that is interesting here is what about the human body and common ancestry? And I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that because the answers were not univocal. They were basically very different. Wasserman said, no, probably no, and Mivar said, most likely yes, so quite different. I suggest that we look at those answers also in the context of the cultural and historical circumstances or the environment in which they were embedded and talking. First, we go to Erich Wasserman. Until 1910, only 2 fossils have been found, 2 fossils that could be part of a common ancestry between humans and non-humans. The first was in Neanderthal in 1856, and in 1895, the Java man, which we call now Java man, that was claimed by, not just by Wasserman, but by many other scientists at that time as not belonging to a possible common ancestry. With regard to the Neanderthals, Wasserman took the position, it was debated among the scientists, and he took the position that yes, they would be part of Homo sapiens, simply because he had a species concept that was that he took from an Austrian paleontologist. The second point is Eric Haeckel's view on the tree of life. So I need to show you that. Okay. Wasserman said we have to distinguish. It's always good to distinguish. He said we need to distinguish between those that say man is directly related to the higher apes and others that say that there is not a direct relationship to them, but they are remotely connected through some ancestors from whom both men and apes are descended. And he was especially attacking the view of Haeckel, which we have here. It says Stammbaum, which is a tree of humans, and then as we see here, we see that the apes, called Affen, are directly leading to man, and that was the first point of critique. The second was that Haeckel had actually branched out several kind of species when he was talking on man. And that was very different to Darwin's position, who said that all humans have a unique origin, and of course the same said Wasserman. Let's come to most likely yes. That was said by Mivar. He had a rather modern concept of the tree of life. He more saw the tree of life as a bush or a grove of trees, as he says it. And the second circumstance was that he was always in a defense position. He was in a defense position from adherence to the theory of evolution and also from some Catholics. And I have one example of, no, I leave that out. I have one example for you here where he answers first politely and and later not so politely anymore to the fact of being criticized by a Catholic priest, Reverend Jeremiah Murphy, who said, this gentleman said, he altogether denies that Catholics are free to hold the doctrine that the body of the first man was naturally evolved by the same ordinary secondary laws which have evolved in the body of his fellow animals. With that, I come to the end. Okay. Erich Waßmann, at the end of his lectures, is asking, are we to fear the downfall of the rock of Christianity? He says, no, by no means. So even if the theory of evolution would gain more support, it would not be a danger. Why? The waves and the rocks are not natural enemies, but natural friends. And the human knowledge and the Christian faith are not opposed to one another. Both are streams flowing from one original source, from one and the same infinite, eternal, and divine wisdom. With this, I come to the end of my talk, and thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, especially on concluding with such an optimistic set of quotes. We have time perhaps for one, maybe even two questions, if there are any from our group here. Perhaps I can, it's an observation really, and it's based on imperfect knowledge, which I'm expert at. But St. John Mivart is, I think, a particularly unsung hero of different ways for looking at evolution. And it's just the observation that Darwin is generally put in a heroic mold. He could do no wrong. But it's very clear that Darwin was extremely irritated by Mivart and got very, to use the English term, very tetchy and really out of sorts and almost lost patience with the man. And I think the reason is that Mivart actually got under his skin intellectually in a rather serious way. And I won't unpack more of Mivart's very remarkable life. It's very different and alike. But so far as I have a question, would it be true to say that although Mendel's paper arrived in London, somehow it was really overlooked, and that the other people who then commented on him, they too remained in obscurity so far as Darwin and his circle were concerned? And they never...
Yes, we know that Mendel sent his paper to a lot of scientists and also to Charles Darwin, but the book has been, or the paper has been found closed, and they had some kind of, you needed to open the pages in order to read them. So it's clear that Charles Darwin did not read that, and yeah, I'm not sure whether he was left in this non-knowledge or not, but of course, but he did not have that knowledge, and it was found basically by experiments of 3 different people who came to the same conclusion. And then they looked at the literature and they found that Darwin's paper had priority. It was also very practical. Because this way it was not a priority struggle between the 3, but they went back to the original author, to Gregor Mendel.
Thank you very much. Well, perhaps we could thank our speaker again for a most interesting talk.